Looks okay, yeah.
Recording. Okay, I think it's okay. Okay, Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov, everybody. Welcome back. Just a quick housekeeping announcement before we begin. Next week, there will not be a shiur. I want to thank everybody for wishing me well for my trip overseas this week. Incidentally, I'm not going overseas, but that's a minor detail. But there won't be a shiur next week either way. But the week after, Bezrat Hashem will be back as usual. Okay, so we are on our final topic of Hilchot Bishul. There's always more to talk about, but we have been discussing for a number of months. The Hilchot of Bishul, going through from Bishul D'Oraita through to Bishul D'Rabanan and the different Gzeirot. We spoke about Shehiyah, we spoke about Chazara, and last week we started to talk about Hatmana, which is insulation, which has a number of practical applications. A lot of relevant questions in terms of covering up food that's on the hot plate, maybe using a crock pot, using a thermos, all sorts of questions that do come up. So last week we started talking about the fundamentals. Today we'll get into some of the more practical applications. Again, a reminder, everything that we are talking about today about Hatmana is about fully cooked food. If the food is not cooked and you start placing it in a heat source, etc., that's a question of bishul. We're not talking about that. We're assuming that is not an issue. We saw last week the basic principles that there are, in fact, two different decrees of Hatmana. Unlike Shehiyah, which applies really from before Shabbat, or Chazara, which applies on Shabbat. So Hatmana applies both before Shabbat and on Shabbat, but there is a difference. We have two types of materials. We saw there's an idea of Hatmana b'davar musif hevel, b'davar sheino musif hevel. There is a material that is going to increase the heat, and there is a material that is only going to maintain the heat. So something which will just maintain the heat, that you cannot insulate on Shabbat itself. Before Shabbat, there is no issue. The reason why, said the Gemara, why are we concerned about insulating something which just maintains the heat? Because on Shabbat you may come, we're worried that you'll find that your food is not as hot as you thought it was, you'll heat it up, and then you'll insulate it, and therefore that's a problem. If before Shabbat you heat up your food, that's fine. Therefore that Gzera only applies on Shabbat itself. As opposed to Hamosif Hevel, a material which is going to increase the heat, okay, that would apply before Shabbat as well, because we're worried that just as you may insulate in something else that increases the heat, so you might come to insulate in ashes and coals, and then you might come to stoke the coals, and even if you want to heat up the food some more, and even if you do that, on Shabbat, you're going to stoke the coals. That, as we've seen, that is a cause for concern in many different situations. That is an av melacha, and that will be a problem. Okay, so that is
also apply to coal, insulated to keep the cold.
I don't know. What do you mean?
If you have something that's cold, you're putting something around it to keep the cold as opposed to having it melt.
Keep the cold.
Cold.
I thought you said coals.
No, cold.
Like kara, right? No, so again, we're talking about it for keeping something warm. If something is not, if it's not warm, if it's not yad soleda, there's no. We'll see today a discussion about a klisheni, for example. So that's that would not be a concern. Right. So that's more or less what we saw last time. The one thing I'll say, you'll ask, so what is a material that's going to increase heat? So here the poskim do discuss, and we'll get into it today. That what if I have a food that is insulated in such a way that maybe the material, it's wrapped up in towels or blankets, those materials themselves are not necessarily going to increase heat, but the whole thing is placed on the hot plate or near the hot plate, so it's in that situation, it's going to increase heat. How do we consider that? We may well consider that as something which increases the heat. Okay, so that is the basic Gzera, and that is the basic prohibition of Hatmana. Now, there are a number of leniencies and a number of ways we're going to allow this. One that we saw, if you open up the book on page 221, so the first thing we saw last time is that Hatmana is considered insulation if I'm doing it for the purposes of heating up the food or keeping the food hot. But if I'm doing it for a different purpose, in order to protect the food, in order to stop it from getting dirty or fall apart, whatever, that is not considered Hatmana. So that is our first leniency. See the Shulchan Aruch, source number 11. He says, "Lasum kelim ala tavshil kedei lishamor min ha'achbalim." You want to guard it from mice or insects or whatever else, or kedei shelo yitanef ba'aforit, so that the food won't become dirty. Shali she'en ze kematmin la'achem. This is permitted. This is not. You're not insulating it. This is not hatmana to keep it warm. Ela kashomer v'noten kisoy alaktera. This is just rather guarding it. right? It's like placing a lid on the pot. We did say that if you cover up food, right, in one layer of aluminium foil, this would apply. If you cover it up in multiple layers, then you're showing that you want to do that in order to eat it, and that would be a problem. Okay, and then we got on to very, very big topic of hatmana b'miktzat, which is partial insulation. Okay, this is going to be, maybe before we mention partial insulation, I'll just mention as well that whenever we talk about insulation, we mean that the thing, it's wrapped up tightly. You have the pot, if there is a space, if there is a gap of air between the pot and the whatever material that it's insulating, that's not called insulating. So somebody asked me last week about an oven. If you have food, without getting into, ovens are complicated because of shiur and chazara and all sorts of other things. But having a pot inside an oven, it's not, we don't consider that to be insulated because there's a large gap, there's a large area of space of air in between the pot and the heating element. So that would not be, at least in terms of hatmana. But in terms of hatmana b'miktzat, meaning if now my pot is not completely wrapped up, but it is partially wrapped up, is that a problem or not? So we saw the Rabbeinu Hananel, and Rabbeinu Hananel brought a case whereby you have a pot that is on coals. So in this case, it's not even, it seems to be that the only place where you have, it's not even on the sides, it's only underneath, but it comes into contact with the coals. That's certainly the case he's talking about, is that where the pot is in contact with the coals, even though it's only from one side, he says that is forbidden. Sefer Yesh, which is Rabbeinu Tam, says that it's permitted, and this is essentially, this is our machloket as to whether partial insulation is permitted or not. Shulchan Aruch, in source number 16, he says as follows. He says, "Kol ze binyan shakdala yoshevet al kisei shel barzel או על גבי אבנים ואינה נוגעת בגחלים, אבל הטמנה על גבי גחלים לדברי הכל אסור." Says the Shulchan Aruch, according to everybody, but only according to the Shulchan Aruch, according to everybody, because according to others it's not the case. But according to the Shulchan Aruch, he says, if you have atmana al gabei gechalim, it's on top of coals, okay, that is going to be prohibited. Now remember, we're dealing with coals, so this is davar she mosif hevel. So this would be even before Shabbat. So based on this, we have to ask a question. We'll see very, very shortly. How, according to the Shulchan Aruch, how am I allowed to ever leave a pot, not from because of Sheyah, but how am I ever allowed to leave a pot on top of a heat source before Shabbat? If I say that it's considered hatmana, that it's placed on top of the coals, or it's placed on top of the fire, we said that is hatmana b'davar shemosif hevel, it's going to increase heat, and then even on Erev Shabbat, it's going to be forbidden. So how am I allowed to do that? So we'll discuss. We'll see, actually, there are some surprising and some very stringent opinions out there. Maybe it's not surprising that there are very stringent opinions out there. There always are. But that is the Shulchan Aruch. We'll leave it for the moment. But the Ramah says differently. The Ramah says, he says, there are those who say, even if my pot is directly on the fire, okay, so long as it's uncovered on the top, that is not called hatmana. Okay. Again, I'm not getting into now again shahiyah and chazara and what's a fire, uncovered fire, covered fire. We've discussed that in the past. Right now, we're just looking from the perspective of hatmana, from the perspective of insulation. But what you see clearly, the Ramah says, if the pot is not fully insulated, it's not fully wrapped up, that is not a problem. That is not hatmana. The question is, when he says kozman shimagula lemala, that it's uncovered on top, does that mean it's enough just the very top, right, the top layer above the pot, or does it mean part of the sides as well? That's a discussion amongst the Achronim, but there are those who are lenient that so long as the very top is not covered, that is okay. Now we have to say it's just brought here in a sort of a footnote. It's not mentioned. We don't have the source in front of us on page 224, but the Chazon Ish rejects this leniency. Okay, just to know, the Chazon Ish holds that hatmana b'miktzat, that partial insulation is considered hatmana, and that would be forbidden. But most of the Ashkenazi poskim reject that, and most follow the Ramah in that way. The Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 19. He says, "Masha amanu shasol atmin." That which we talk about hatmana, insulation, that's only when the pot is covered from all sides. But if you do not cover all the sides, then that is permitted. Obviously, this is all talking about where the food is fully covered, and therefore he says, Lachen, fully cooked, thank you. לכן מותר לכסות במגבת וכדומה את המכסה בלבד של הקדרה. So if you were to cover, for example, only the lid of the pot, אפילו אם היא עומדת על גבי האש, right, you're not covering the sides, you just put the plata cover, whatever, on top, and the sides are open. אם אמנם התבשיל שבה כבר מבושל קוצוקו, that is allowed. That is allowed. Now, all of that is according to the Ramah, as we've said, according to the Shulchan Aruch. Partial insulation is still going to be forbidden. Now the Shulchan Aruch Harav has an interesting leniency over here. He says, you see in source number 20, he says, "אבל בשבת בדבר שאינו מוסיף לכולי עלמא לא מיצר אלא כשמטמין כולו." Says the Shulchan Aruch Harav, this entire discussion, what we're talking about partial insulation at Mana b'Miktzat, that is only in a case of a davar shemosif hevel. That is only something which increases the heat. But if it's a material that does not increase the heat, okay, then he says everybody would agree, even the Shulchan Aruch would agree, that partial insulation is allowed. Does that help us with the plata? Probably not. Because once it's on the plata, it's on the fire, at least the layer from underneath is going to still be increasing the heat. So this would still seem to be a problem. Again, according to the Shulchan Aruch. But you can see here a summary up to this point. Source number 21, 39. Yeah, he says covering even most of the surface of the hot container is permitted as long as a significant area is left exposed. What does significant mean? He says an uninsulated area that's larger than what would be acceptable for insulation purposes if the restriction of Atmanah was not a consideration. And therefore, it's permitted to pot toweling over an urn or hot pot of soup as long as a small but significant part of the urn or pot is left exposed. Right? The point is, it's not that you wrap up the entire thing and a tiny square you leave out to say it's not there's not a harama. It means really partial insulation. It means partial insulation, not the entire thing. Not the entire thing is covered up. Now, for Svardim, as we've seen, there is a chumrah here in that you cannot do partial insulation. And we asked the question, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu has a very, very, very stringent approach. It's not accepted by all the Sfardi poskim. But his understanding of a hot plate, of a plata shel Shabbat, is quite stringent as follows. We discussed when we discussed hot plates in the context of chazara. So we saw that there were those who would say that you could even, Rav Avadia, for example, said that on Shabbat itself, you could, in terms of the chot of chazara, you could return food directly onto the hot plate. You don't need a separation. Other poskim, most poskim would say you do, in order that it doesn't look like cooking. But Rav Mordechai Eliyahu comes at this from a different angle. Not only does he not accept that, but he holds that since this is the way that you cook, and this is the way that it's manufactured, he holds that the hot plate itself is considered an open flame, not a covered flame. He holds it to be an open flame. And therefore, he says that in terms of, never mind chazara, but in terms of halachot of hatmana, you can't leave it on, directly on, even from before Shabbat. Again, for Ashkenazim, this will not be a concern. But says Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, source number 22, he says, Kevan shel plata regila kayom, yesh din shel esh meguleh. Okay, that in itself is a tremendous chiddush. But that is his shita. He says that it's considered an open flame. And therefore, he says, Asur la'ashot ma'achalem yeshirot al-plata regila me'erev Shabbat midinat mana. He says, even before Shabbat, you can't leave food directly on the hot plate, because that would be hatmana. Remember, hatmana b'davar mosif hevel, and something which increases heat is forbidden even before Shabbat. Well, that's exactly, go back to page 222. That was Rabbeinu Hananel, meaning that was the source of this whole discussion. He says, as far as he says, Kagon kiseh shel barzel, v'agdara yoshevet alea, v'yiblea o ba'avanim o b'chayotze ba. Aval hatmana al gabei gechalim divrei hakol asur. In other words, he says, so long as his point is, when you've got food that is over the heat source, but it's not in direct contact with the heat source, that's the whole discussion of Shiur. But once it's touching, meaning, essentially, what are you saying is you've got food that is in contact with the material that is keeping it warm. So why do I care if it's in contact from underneath or from the sides or from both? He's saying so long as it's in contact, what's my concern? My concern is you're going to come and stoke the coals. Okay, so you've got coals underneath.
And I'm just saying, like classify all these things as hatmana, it's like a bit of a stretch.
That's because you're already used to the definition of what the later pots are going to accept, to say that hatmana means when it's completely insulated. That's just how we think about it. But who said, right? If we go back to first principles, that's exactly the discussion. So there are those who say, again, you're Ashkenazi, so you follow the Ramah, so hatmana b'miktzar is not hatmana, so you're okay, etc. But the Shulchan Aruch is more stringent on this. So Rav Mordechai Eliyahu said, so again, you can see that this is a chumrah because it's based on number one, the fact that we're concerned for hatmana b'miktzad, which in itself is a chumrah. Number two, the fact that you're saying that the plata is an open flame, which is itself a chumrah. But that's how he holds. And therefore he says, asur la'ashot ma'achalim shel plata regla me'erev Shabbat b'din hatmana b'davar mosif hever hasura af me'erev Shabbat. Okay, what's the solution if you're going to follow this opinion? So he talks here about something called a plata Yerushalmit. Okay, not to be confused with a Kugel Yerushalmit, but a plata Yerushalmit is built in a certain way that there is sort of he says that there's a gap between the metal element and the food, so it's not direct in that way. It's not directly on the fire. Or he says if you have not a plata Yerushalmit but a regular plata, so he says if you put something on top of the plata or an inverted pan or whatever it is, and then you put your food on top, so now it's not directly on, and that would solve the problem of hatmana in his opinion. Again, many are not stringent for this. Even Sfardim who follow the Shulchan Aruch, and maybe this will help to understand with Shalom's point. What he says, he understands that hatmana is not if I have the pot placed on the fire or on the coals, but if the pot is sinking into the coals, at least okay, it's not covered completely, but then it's somewhat inside. Then that would be a question of hatmana. But if it's just placed directly on top, that is no issue, and therefore he says that would be the case of with a blech or with a hot plate or anything like that, and therefore that is okay and that is accepted even for Sfardim. Okay, that's just leaving the pot itself on top of the hot plate. But everybody would agree, at least it's a question of hatmana b'miktzad. If I have the pot on top of the hot plate, and now I have my towels or my plata cover or blanket or whatever that goes on top. Okay, that's going to be a question. That's our next section that begins on page 228. You see hatmana on a hot plate before Shabbat. Now, so the question is precisely this: if we're talking about before Shabbat, so again we've said that if you're doing hatmana in a material which only maintains the heat before Shabbat, that is accepted, that is allowed. On Shabbat itself, no hatmana at all is permitted, whatever material. But before Shabbat, if it's a material which maintains the heat, that is okay. However, if it is davar mosif hever, something which is going to increase the heat, then that is going to be prohibited even before Shabbat. So now our question is like this. I have my pot which is placed on the hot plate and I'm covering it up. Let's say I'm wrapping it all around with a plata cover, a blanket, whatever. So essentially, the main material which I'm using to insulate the pot is not going to be something which increases heat. If I have a pot and I just cover it up with a towel, I won't increase the heat. But because I'm covering it up with a towel and it's on top of the hot plate, so now the heat is going to increase. So does this qualify as exactly that case? So here we have a machloket rishonim between the Ramban and the Rashba. I have to tell you, as I was thinking about this as I was walking into the shiur this morning, there are many Tzurba Rabbanan shiurim going on around the world. But I think this is the only one where the streets just around us, are the names of the Rishonim that were having the machloket between. So that's a special distinction that we have. Okay. Relates to what we spoke about yesterday. It's Udash Lishit for those who are here. So essentially the Gemara has a case as follows. Source number 24, it says, Damar Bizera Mishum Chad Dever Biyanai, Pupa Shetamanba, Asur Lanicha al Gefet Shel Zaitim. Okay, Gefet Shel Zaitim, this is the residue of olives, which the Gemara understands to be one of those materials which Musif Hever, which adds heat. So the case is you have your food in a pot which is in a basket, it's already insulated, and then you place that on top of this, or inside, or on top of this Gefet Shel Zaitim. So what exactly is the case over there? So the Ramban, in source number 25, he says, Adam Rinan Kupashat Amanba, Asur Lanicha Gabe Gefet Shel Zaitim, בשאין לה שוליים, או שהן הופכים קופה או פיה, להיות הקטרה תמונה בתוכה ומונחת על הגפת, והקטרה עצמה נוגעת בהן. In other words, that the pot now is coming into direct contact with the gefet shel zaitim. It's in direct contact with the material which is going to add the heat. However, if that is not the case, if I've insulated it in one material, and now that is going to come into contact, or that is nearby this other material which is going to ultimately increase the heat, that would not be a problem. So says the Ramban. Source number 26. It says, "Shafilu shulaim la kevan shenogin bagefet atzma nikretet mana she'im taman b'dvar she'no mosif v'taman al kol b'davar mosif." That's the key line. Af ze asur. Okay. But again, that is where it is making contact. Okay, so the Ramban is actually going to be the lenient. Easier to understand if we contrast with what the Rashba says. Source number 27. And the Rashba here says as follows. He says, "Nered ma shelo asru kan ela b'shetaman hakupa, haynu afilu b'she'en shulei hakdera v'kupa dfukim al pnei hagefet." Even if the bottom of the pot and the basket are not pressed against the olive residue, meaning there is not even direct contact here, but it is ultimately going to heat it up. Sort of hanging over. In other words, machloket between the Ramban and the Rashba regarding this case of Gefet in the Gemara is as follows. According to everybody, the case we're talking about is you have a pot which is insulated in a different material, one that does not increase heat. Okay, according to Ramban, only if that then comes into direct contact with the material which is going to increase heat, would it be forbidden? Talking about before Shabbat. But if it's not in direct contact, but it's nearby, but it's ultimately indirectly going to cause it to heat up, nonetheless, it's not directly insulated in the material which adds heat, and therefore it is allowed. That is the Ramban. That is the lenient view. The Rashba, which takes a different approach, he says no. He says so long as it is ultimately causing it to increase the heat, I don't care if it's touching directly or if it's nearby or however it works. But the point is, he says that is forbidden. And the Shulchan Aruch here rules stringently, as does the Torah. You can see here, just in between source 27 and 28, we quote here the Torah, who also assumes the stringent position, writing he does not know of any reason to be lenient in this regard. Okay, says the Shulchan Aruch. So he says, if I have a kira, remember kira, the stove in those days, where kind of you have the coals at the bottom, and then on top there's this platform, and there's a hole where you place your pot. So we've learned, Siman Reish Nun Gimel, we've learned in previous Tzurba Rabbanan Shiurim, that there are ways of allowing that to be there before Shabbat. That's from Din Shehiyah. He says, nonetheless, okay, but if the pot is now wrapped up, even though you've wrapped it in towels or in clothes or something which in and of itself is not going to increase the heat, since the fire is underneath, is going to add heat, therefore that will be forbidden. Turn over the page, you can see the illustration at the bottom of page 230. For the benefit of those who are watching on Zoom, we'll just put it up there. Hope that you can see it. Okay, but that is essentially, that is your kira. You have the pot on top, and again, bear in mind, the pot now, it does not come into direct contact with the coals. It's above the coals that's keeping it hot. But since the pot is now insulated, so that's precisely the case we were talking about. According to the Ramban, that would be permitted. That is not called insulation, but davar hamosif hevel, because that which it's wrapped in is not adding heat, and it's not in direct contact with the material which is going to add heat. However, according to the Rashba, and this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins, since it's insulated and it's adding heat. In other words, we could phrase it like this. According to the Ramban, the question is, you cannot insulate in a material which increases heat. According to the Rashba, we would say you cannot insulate when it will, in a situation where it's going to increase heat. Never mind that whatever the material that's around the pot. So now, since we rule stringently, that would seem to imply then if I have my food on the hot plate, okay, and we'll go like Rav Ben Zion Bashaul, that the hot plate itself is not considered insulation. But if I was to wrap up the pot, wrap it up tightly with a towel, with a plata cover, whatever, that would seem to be forbidden. So either if it's not wrapped up, I would have to say at this point, either it's not wrapped up tightly, so there's a space of air in between, and therefore that's not considered insulation. Or according to Ashkenazim, if it's only insulated from the top or from the sides, so it's not completely covered, that's atmana b'miktzat, and then that would be allowed in that way. Right, Mishnah Berurah says here, he says explicitly, there are gabei kira, inu shema midar gabei kira milamala al piyah, v'en shulei gdera nogim b'gechalim shel hamata. Right, that's the Rashba, the Shulchan Aruch, to tell you that even if it's not actually touching the coals, we still have the prohibition. Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 30, says achasur latmin kdera afilu min bod yom b'ofen sheosif la chom. Right, you cannot insulate even before Shabbat in a way that's going to increase heat. כגון על ידי כיסוי הקדרה בשמיכות, כשהיא על גבי האש, או על גבי פלטה חשמלית. Okay, exactly what we've said. To have it insulated in blankets or in a way where the heat is going to increase because it's on the hot plate, that would not be allowed.
Would there be nothing to say, would sequencing making a difference? Like, in other words, if you wrapped it up before you put on the plata, right? The plata, it's not the plata's cold, right? You do that before you put it on that way in the first place, right? It's like you're right? Like put it on, instead of like it's on and then you wrap it and you're increasing heat, right? You put it on, it's already wrapped up.
If you put it on, it's already wrapped up. Would that make a difference?
You put that away.
I don't think so, because ultimately we're saying is that you're saying the insulation is done first, and then I'm putting it on the pot. I think we would say that we view both actions as together as part of the package, and therefore the order would not make a difference. However, Rav Ovadia does have a leniency here. Rav Ovadia says as follows, source number 31. Is עולם הגאון מעלה אבן טובה בחוט המשולש כתב הלוב נהגו להקל כדעת הרמב"ן ז"ל שכדאי לסמוך עליו וכתב זה עליו זכור ליצחק שאף שמרן לא פסק כן אפשר שכך היה מנהגם ימי קדם קודם שנתפשטו הוראות מרן ז"ל. So very interesting. Rav Ovadia, everybody knows, was very insistent that we have to accept all the rulings of Maran. Maran is the Shulchan Aruch. Nowadays every second rabbi is Maran. But Maran is the Beit Yosef. That is Rabbi Yosef Karo. That is the Shulchan Aruch. And Rav Ovadia is very insistent in many places. This was his whole. We have all the horot of Maran, and we have to accept the Shulchan Aruch, except where we don't. There's a number of cases. There are a number of tshuvot Rav Ovadia as well, where he rules differently. But over here, so he says first of all that you see in a number of the earlier tshuvot and earlier the Sephardi tshuvot, that they followed the ruling of the Ramban. So he says it could be that was already the minhag in many places where before Maran that to be lenient in this regard, and therefore he brings that is one factor that maybe to be lenient in, even though we accept Maran and we accept the Shulchan Aruch, but nonetheless there is what to rely on there. But he says all the more so when we're dealing with a hot plate. Why? If we combine that with the following svara, why is there a prohibition of hatmana? Because you might come to stoke the coals. So on a hot plate, how are you going to stoke the coals? There are no coals. You can't stoke the coals. You can't change the temperature. You can't change the settings. So again, we know that even if the reason for the gzerah does no longer apply, most of the time we will still keep the gzerah. We don't have the authority to undo that. But that combined with the fact of the Ramban and things, therefore he says there is what to rely on in terms of this. So if you look at the bottom of page 231, just a brief summary of what we've seen until now, right? Does placing food directly on a hot plate constitute hatmana? So we saw Rav Mordechai Eliyahu says yes. Okay, that is based on the fact that he holds that it's considered directly the fire, and B, that it's partial hatmana is a prohibition. However, As we've seen, number one, according to the Ramash, Shabbat Kilchata, or the Ashkenazi poskim, we would say no, that's not an issue because partial atmana is allowed. Atmana b'mikta. Number two, even for the Svardim, that's like the Shulchan Aruch we saw of Ben Zion Abasha'ol. He says since the pot does not sink inside the hot plate, that's not actually called atmana, and that would be accepted. So I think the prevalent opinion nowadays is that we don't consider leaving food on a hot plate before Shabbat as atmana. Those who follow Rav Mordechai Eliyahu have that stringency, but most poskim do not. Now, is covering food on a hot plate equivalent to atmana with something that adds heat? Right, that was the question that we just discussed. The hot plate itself is not hatmana, but if I cover up the pot on top and on the sides, would that be hatmana? So according to the Rashba, we saw the tools Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, yes, okay. Still, according to Ashkenazim, nonetheless, you can still place your plata cover on top of your pot, so long as it's not covering the entire pot and it's not very, very tight. That would still be permitted. And all the more so would be permitted according to the Ramban and Rav Ovadia, as we've just seen. Okay, may one partially cover the food? That was the first thing we spoke about. I don't know why that's lost in the chart, but that's we saw the Chazon Ish does have a stringency regarding that. Okay, so that's in terms of the hot plate, and therefore lamaise, generally speaking, so long as one wants to place the plata cover on top, right? So long as there's a bit of a gap between the towel or whatever it is and the food, or it's not completely covering, okay, certainly for Ashkenazim that would be permitted. One doesn't have to be concerned that that's hatmana.
Is it only a residue that he talks about? It's kind of an example.
I mean, that's just the Mishnah lists the different materials, and Geffen is one of those, which is Mosif Hevel. So that's the case. It's discussed in the Gemara over there, but it's used as a prototype for anything which is Mosif Hevel. Yeah.
Anything can move you further from a problem. Or even if you have like hatmana, if you put on a plata that has a red on top of it.
Yes.
You're not even going to get their hatmana anymore because of that, right? Like you're that far away from it.
In terms of the platter itself, if you're now going to wrap up the pot from all the sides, then it would still
even if you have a reshet on top of your plata and you're going to need something on top of that reshet, which is not on top of just like that far away from the plata.
I'm saying if you're going to wrap the pot up very tightly in terms of blankets, there would be a concern. Yeah. Okay. So let's see now some other cases which come up. Page 232. The Gemara here, Masechet Shabbat, Daf Nun Aleph. Source number 32. 32 on page 232. Okay. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Lo asru ela oto mecham, aval pina mimecham lemecham mutar. Okay, so we mentioned earlier that let's say you have an urn, a cup or whatever it is where you're keeping hot water that you wrap up and you insulate. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, in that mecham, it's going to be forbidden. Aval pina mimecham lemecham, but you took from that and you poured into something else, then that's going to be allowed. Now, I remember once when I was in yeshiva, so one of my friends always used to laugh at me because he used to have in the morning, sometimes have a cup of tea. We spoke about Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi and how it cools down, etc. So always, when I was in a little bit of a hurry to finish breakfast, I wanted to drink the tea and it was still hot. So I would take another cup and I would pour from one cup into the other. They would always look at me and say, what's this, Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi business that you've got? This learning is all getting to your head. But anyway, but the point is you pour from one to another. That action of pouring from the first cup to the second cup, that is done why? In order to cool the water down. So you're telling me now that you're trying to cool it down, you've demonstrated that you're interested in cooling it down. Now you're going to keep it hot. That doesn't make sense. So he says, you are cooling it down, right? You've taken steps to cool the water. So now we're worried that you're going to go and you're going to boil it up again. That doesn't make sense. Okay, we do things that don't make sense sometimes, but generally we try and follow logic in the halakha, and therefore the Shulchan Aruch says, source number 33. says, "Im pinat tavshil b'Shabbat mikdera shenitbashel ba likdera acheret mutar latmino b'davar she'eino mosif hever." Okay, so essentially now my food is in a kli sheni. It's not in the original pot where I cooked it, but I put it into another pot. I'm allowed to insulate that pot b'davar she'eino mosif hever, in a material that is not going to increase heat. Again, this is on Shabbat. Before Shabbat, there's no question you can do that, but even on Shabbat, why? Because b'davar she'mosif hever, the material that increases heat, our concern is you're going to come to stoke the coal. If it's insulating in something that does not increase heat, remember what was our concern there? Our concern was that you might come and find your pot is not as hot as you wanted, and you might boil up the pot again. So yeah, the whole point is by pouring it into a kli sheni, you've demonstrated that you're not interested in heating it up, and therefore you're allowed to insulate it in something that is not going to increase the heat, but just maintain the heat. So where this, yeah.
The cliche is not on the platter.
No. Again, if it's on the platters, then we go back to the whole discussion of the Vashem Mosif Hevel. Here we're talking about Dashe no Mosif Hevel. But that's right. You have a cliche just sitting on the kitchen counter. That would be, you'd be allowed to wrap that up. The Chazon Ish talks about, the question of a thermos, or as it's called in Hebrew, a thermos. So, source number 34. He says, seemingly here you could pour water from an urn into a thermos on Shabbat. Right? Even if we consider the thermos itself to be hatmana, nonetheless it's a kli sheni. Okay, for various reasons, he says, therefore, that using a thermos flask, he says, would be permitted, as it's primarily because of the kli sheni. There is in the footnote here, different source number 28, footnote 28, you can see there are a number of different poskim that are quoted. With Moshe Feinstein, who's also lenient. Okay, and many others. Rav Wosner has a slightly different approach here. I think is a bit more stringent, but and therefore he says that. But even somebody who's ill or somebody who needs it could be even according to Rav Wosner, one could use over there. All right, source number 35 at the top, the Shabbos Kitchen by Rav Simcha Ben Cohen in English. He says if the need arises to insulate hot food on Shabbat, one should transfer the food to a kli sheni and insulate that second container. Based on the shul, a baby bottle filled with warm drink, kli sheni, may be wrapped in a towel to retain its heat. Okay. Another question that comes up is in terms of insulating food within food. Okay, I think the poskim I talk about, just before source number 36, there's a question, right? Such as placing kishka wrapped in foil inside a cholent. The larger question is why you would want the kishka in the first place, but we'll leave that for now. But okay, so you have, but if you have food, or kugel or rice or whatever it is, and you place that inside, is that a question of hatmana, of placing food inside food? So the Mishnah Berurah says here, he says, "Katvu achronim shasur likach kli ubetocho mashke tzonen v'letchov oto b'shabbat lekli malei mayim chamin shitchamen betocho." He says, if you have a kli of food, liquid in this case, but it doesn't matter, and you have it in the kli, and you place that inside your hot water, okay. Water, food, doesn't matter, it's the same thing. He says that is forbidden. Since the whole thing is entirely submerged. We've already learned, right, if you're Ashkenazi, okay, there is already a solution in terms of, let's say, if we're talking about a baby bottle, for instance, and you're putting that inside a thing of hot water, okay, so long as it's not fully submerged, that's hatmana b'miktzat, and that is not, and that is not a problem. But notice what
it's eating the food.
What?
Even though it's maybe eating the milk, not just keeping it warm.
Yeah. So again, it has to be that it was. So we ask a question of how hot it is, when it's going to get to Yad Soledet, etc. But he's talking about the food is in a container. Meaning we're not just taking the food itself. What does he say right at the beginning? He says asur likach kli ubetocho mashke tzonem v'letchov oto b'shabbat lekli malei mayim chamin. What if we have just the food itself, right? That's not necessarily in the container. If it's in maybe a plastic bag or the foil or something like that. So, or nothing. Okay. So if if it's nothing, if it's just food inside food, then it's hard to see where the question could even begin. Meaning you have food. I have a pot of food that's cooking. There's food with the meat and the potatoes, whatever in the cholent. There's no question. So the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat number 37 says, "Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdi mipam achad nechnasti achal Rabbi leveit hamelchatz bikashti laniach lo pach shel shemen be'ambati." So he says he had this jar of oil in Hanukkah, jar of oil and wanted to place it in this hot bathtub. Amari told bekli sheni v'tein. So he says you could do it in a kli sheni. So that's so there's a lot to talk about in terms of this. Gemara says that you learn three things from there. We learn about kli sheni and etc. A long, complicated discussion. But regarding the issue here of hatmana, even if it's why is this not an issue? So the Chazon Ish discusses there are those who learn from this Gemara that we're just dealing with the case of hatmana b'miktzat, whereas it wasn't fully submerged. As we've said, according to the Chazon Ish, that doesn't work because the Chazon Ish is going to say that hatmana b'miktzat he considers to be prohibited as well. So he says, let's just skip to the part which is in bold towards the end of source number 38. He says, "Omnam lemasha katavti the miktzata tmunam miklei hatmana." Says the Chazon Ish, according to my opinion, whereby partial hatmana is still going to be a problem. Muchach b'Gemara de'ein tina b'chamim bichlal hatmana. He says placing, and again here it's a pach shel shemen, so it's within a different container, but placing that inside hot water or inside food, right? That is not considered hatmana. כמו שכתבתי לעיל, וכך מותר להשקיע כוס סונן מוקף צמיד פתיר תוך חמים, כך שאין בו משום בישול. In other words, so the Chazon Ish surprisingly is lenient. The Mishnah Berurah said you cannot do hatmana inside food. Okay, the Chazon Ish says no, there is no issur of, although there is an issur of hatmana b'miktzat. According to his opinion, there is no issur of hatmana inside food. Okay. But here we don't rule like the Chazon Ish. Here we are generally stringent. So the Shmirat Shabbat Kelchata in source number 39, he says, "Asor lachnes afilu mibod yom kufsat shimulim skula ala ochel Shabbat betoch gdela." I have whatever container of food. I can't place it inside a pot of hot water. Shezom omedet al gabei ha'esh kashamayim hachamim machasim legamrei et hakufsa. When it is going to be completely submerged. But now, what about putting in, like we said before, putting in if it's not in a closed vessel, just the food itself? So here says the Shmirat Shabbat on source number 40. It says, "Mutar lachnis mibod yom sakit bad im oles v'chadome latoch hamalak shal gabei ha'esh." I have a cloth bag of rice or noodles or whatever it is, and I want to place that into the soup. Is that here? I'm doing it. He's talking about before Shabbat. Okay, before Shabbat, clearly there's not going to be an issue of bishul, but also it could be an issue of hatmana because it's on the fire and it's davar mosif ever. Okay, but he says ein bo mishum isur hatmana. Here there is no prohibition of hatmana. This is like just putting food inside food, and that is not a problem. Just like we said right at the beginning, if it is wrapped up, here it's wrapped up in a bag. Why is that? That's not because I want to keep it hot, but that's just so it won't all crumble apart, etc. In the soup. Yeah.
Is that why you could use a tea bag in Shiur?
Is that why? So tea bag as a whole is a whole different. You're saying in terms of hatmana. I think, I mean, but the tea bag is more. It's more of a concern of bishul. That's what the poskim talk about. But
it's the cliche.
Or probably a klishlishi by that point. So yeah, and there's not really an issue of. In any event, essentially you're putting in the tea bag and you're taking it out straight away. So the concern of hatmana also does that. I don't think the poskim really talk about hatmana when it comes to the tea bags, but that's but that is a separate issue of bishul, which is simple. There are those who just have to say, because you mentioned there are those who are stringent regarding the tea bags, but there are those who are lenient by the Kli Shlishi. That's Rav Moshe Feinstein and others. Okay, but he says here, now it's interesting how we have a change in the Shmirat Shabbat K'Chada from the second edition to the third edition. So you'll see source number 40. This is from the previous edition. So he says you could put the cloth bag with the food into the pot, but he says mikom makom im michloch pashtida b'niar aluminium v'yachniso letoch hachamin shal gabei ha'esh yesh po mishum isur hatmana. He says if I have kugel or something else that's completely wrapped up in aluminium foil, he says that would be forbidden. Okay, unless he says at the end, if you've got holes in the aluminium foil, and the poskim require that, then that would not be a problem. Now, over the page in source number 41, this is in the next edition. He here is a bit more lenient. He says, "Mutar lachnis b'modium sakitim oz v'chadameh latoch hamalak shel gavei ha'esh v'ein zo derech hatmana derech bishul." This is not considered hatmana. This is considered bishul. But I suppose it could be that the tea could be a similar logic. V'af mutar lichloch pashtida b'niar aluminium hamechaseh et ha'ochel mikol hatzadim. He says even if it's in aluminium foil, it's the same thing. You just want to put the food in, and that's not considered right hatmana, and therefore that's allowed. He says so you don't have to poke holes in the aluminium foil. That is allowed. It's like two different types of food that are heating up in the fire. It's the same as if I have the chant, I have the meat and the potatoes. Right? It's the same. It's the same thing, and therefore that's okay. Right, Rav Ben Sion Abba Shaul over here is similarly lenient. Okay, one final topic that comes up regarding hatmana, and this is the issue of slow cookers or crockpots, or as it's called in Hebrew, crockpot. Right, that is actually called in Hebrew sil bishuliti. All right, if there's anybody who doesn't know what a crockpot is, which I'm sure everybody does, but on page 237 there is a photo which you can see. This was actually the last shaila that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach dealt with in his life. Just before he died, he was asked about the crockpot, and he wrote about it, and he wasn't completely conclusive at the end of the day. But this was the last. This was the last shaila that he dealt with. So there are lots of questions in terms of slow cookers. There's a question in terms of shehiyah and bichazara. It's not our topic right now, but it's a question of hatmana. Is it considered that you're insulating? How does it work? You have the pot which you put the food into, right? And that pot essentially is an insert which goes into the metal frame, which has got the heating element. So you are essentially insulating the pot. So here our question would, and it's certainly davar shemostiv hevel because it's on the fire. So our question would primarily relate to this question which we've already dealt with of hatmana b'miktzat. Right, according to the Shulchan Aruch, it would seem to be more problematic because even though it's only partially insulated, nonetheless, the Shulchan Aruch still forbids that. What about according to the Ramah, who says that partial insulation is permitted? So Rav Shlomo Zalman in source number 43, Minchat Shlomo, he says, "Kevan shek de'ama tavshil mechuseh mutmenet kula or ruba betoch machshir chimum chashmali." He says essentially the entire pot, or certainly the majority of the pot, is insulated. Okay, it's inside this metal frame with the heating element. He says, you're telling me there's a little bit of a gap in between where it fits in. He says, no, that's the way that you cook. That's not considered a gap at all. And he says, therefore, I would think that this is considered completely, this is hatmana, and this is forbidden. And then he says, he says, then when I saw the pot, I said, not only is it a problem of hatmana, but it's also going to be a problem of sheyah and chazara. So what's the solution? I guess it sounds like he was asked by the one who was manufacturing the pot. He says, like, ובכל ערב שבת יפסיקו בה בין קדרת התבשיל והמכשיר, וטוב שתהיה גם בולטת וניכרת שמפסקת ביניהם וגם ממעטת קצת החום החשמל. Okay? He says essentially what you would have to do is you need to create a gap between the pot that goes inside and that which is heating it up. And therefore, remember, we said atmana is only when it's really tightly wrapped around. So he says, some people, if you were to put a layer of aluminium foil, for example, that seems to create a bit of a gap. Or if you put at the bottom of the pot some bits of foil, or some people put pebbles and things like that, which sort of raises the pot a little bit. You don't want to raise it too much because then it's not going to cook. But if you do that and create a gap, that according to Rav Shlomo Zalman would be sufficient. Others do not require that at all. Shevet HaLevi, over the page, source number 44. So he says, no, He says this is really not Hatmana in the first place. Because as we've seen, we said that partial Hatmana is not going to be a problem. And he learns from the Rama. Have a look in the second paragraph, maybe in bold. It says, Vadai muchach, dakor taloi bazeh mechuseh gam milamala. Okay? Essentially, according to the Rama, where I don't have, the pot is not covered from the top. Okay, whatever you want to say, if you look again at the picture of the crock pot, even if it's completely covered from the sides, so the fact is that on top it is not covered, and therefore he says that is not hatmana, or that's at least hatmana b'miktzad, what the Rama would say, and therefore says the Shevet HaLevi, he says if one wants to be stringent, they can, but what is it? What's his language? It says lal ish al elu sheken matilim ze ein beyadenu. Okay, that's enough. Yeah.
Not covered on top, it has covered.
No, the pot itself has a lid. That's right. But again, when we talk about Hatmana, we're saying my pot with the lid being wrapped up. Yeah. The truth is that it might be. I don't know. There are different models, but if you look at this picture, for example, the way that this and a lot of the crock pots are made today is that you have the pot itself has this kind of rim on the top that goes out. So it's not just the top, but it's protruding from the top, and that might even be, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that might be sufficient. Okay, number of sources here in the Achronim also who talk about this. If one wants to be stringent, you can see here Shvat Shabbat in the name of Rav Eliashiv, Rav Shechter, source number 46, source 47. Maybe we'll just read that. Right, Rav Ribiat. He says certain minor adjustments can be made on the crock pot whereby the halachic dispute can be circumvented entirely. This can be accomplished by simply lining inside walls of the cylinder with foil and allowing the foil to extend noticeably higher than the cylinder walls. That's like you see in the picture. This adjustment acts as a kind of neutralizing barrier between the walls of the food container in the following way. The interposition of the foil lining serves to reduce the intensity of the heat from the insulation, hatmana. At the same time, the visible presence of the lining also helps eliminate the appearance of normal insulation. Thus, the simple procedure rectifies that Hatmana problem. Again, that is for those who are stringent, but as we've seen, there are those who say even that it would not be required. In terms of, he writes here as well, the controls unit should preferably be removed, taped, or covered before Shabbat. That is also to deal with the issue of shehiyah, right? If we're concerned about shehiyah in terms of leaving the food cooking before Shabbat, right? If it's fully cooked, then then we're okay. But if it's not fully cooked, so then having those controls there would seemingly mean that it's considered like an open flame, like one where you can stoke the coals, and covering up those controls would be helpful in terms of maybe changing the status to be like Rufa Ketuma, as we've discussed in previous Shiur. Okay. Just to conclude, have a look at page 240, some machshava as we finish. We've now spent a considerable number of shiurim dealing with all the laws of Hilchot Bishul on Shabbat. You're all experts on it now, and we can have our hot food and we can have our warm food and keep it, especially at this time of year. But I go back to what somebody said to me a number of weeks ago, right? Why do we need all of this? Why don't we just have cold cuts for lunch on Shabbat, right? Then we don't have to. So that is not so simple. That is problematic as well for the following reason. Have a look at the Ramah in source number 48. Right? The point of having all these complicated halachot is not to prevent us from eating hot food on Shabbat. We want to eat hot food on Shabbat. We need to do it in the proper way. We need to learn halacha. We need to come to Tzuma Rabbanan, right? That's why we learn. But says the Rama, mitzvah latmin l'Shabbat k'dei shochal chamin b'Shabbat. You might think of hatmana b'miktzat and not and klishayni and klirishon. Who needs all of this? I'm just going to eat cold. Says no. You have a mitzvah. Chazal wants you to insulate your food in the permitted way and to eat hot on Shabbat. Kizeu mikavod ve'oneg Shabbat. This is part of kavod Shabbat. This is part of oneg Shabbat. You're going to have challenge. What's Shabbat without challenge? V'kol mi she'eno ma'amin b'divrei chachamim. Anybody who doesn't believe the words of the sages, and it says it's forbidden to eat hot food on Shabbat, we're worried he might be an apikoros. Wow. So again, what's the background? Why is the Rama saying that? So this is based on the Bala Ma'or and based on earlier sources, which we have seen, I think, in the past. But essentially, there was a sect, right, of some of them still exist today, called the Karaim. And the Karaim did not believe in the oral law. So they saw the pasuk that said, "Lo tevalu esh b'chol mashvotechem b'yom Shabbat." Don't kindle a fire in your places on Shabbat. That means you can't light a fire before Shabbat, right? We know that. But they thought it meant you can't have a fire lit. So they would eat in the dark and they would eat cold, right? No fires and no light and no warmth. And so we're worried that if somebody here refuses to eat hot food on Shabbat, I'm just going to have cold cuts the whole, cold cuts and potato salad the whole Shabbat. We say you might be a karai. You might, maybe it's because you don't believe in the authority of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and therefore we are very, very stringent to make sure that we eat well and that we eat the cholent. He brings here in the Piskei Teshuvot, I've mentioned this before, he says even if you should at the very least, so if you don't have the cholent, have a look at the top of page 241. He says, this is why we cholent on Shabbat. This is a minhag that you cannot deviate from. He says, okay, and I've actually been at places where they serve a tea with a tea bag, without a tea bag, however you do it. But they serve the tea at the end of the meal, and they say, "Yeah, would you like your cholent?" Right? That's in order to fulfill this meal, to make sure we have the hot food, we have a hot drink, we have something that we don't want to go against the sages in that way. Okay. So Adkan, that concludes our limud of Yichot Bishul b'Shabbat. Next week, as I mentioned, there is no shiur, but the week after, B'ezrat Hashem will return. We're up to the halachot of dash and schita, squeezing fruit from fruit onto food, milking animals on Shabbat, squeezing absorbed liquid. Okay, so we have and that will be the final shiur. Or that and one more, then that will conclude volume 18, and we'll continue the study of Yichot Shabbat. Okay. Have a good day, everybody, and a wonderful week.
Yeah.